Howdy.
Howdy.
The one that's going to do the documentary on Ben Thompson?
I am.
Okay, come on in. The Purple Sage, you're welcome. Well, come on in and see my collections on Ben Thompson, who was a notorious gunfighter of the Old West. He's not quite as famous as some of the other gunfighters maybe, but he was nevertheless a notorious gunfighter who hung out in various places. But a couple of unusual things about Ben Thompson are that he's one of the very few foreign-born American gunfighters of the Old West. He was born in Nottingham, England, in 1842, and his parents brought him to America, and they settled in Austin, Texas in 1851. His father was a sea captain, so Ben had a little bit of nautical background, but he soon, when he was very young, got into the printing business in Austin, and he not only worked in the printing business in Austin, but New Orleans as well. But one of the unusual things about Ben that he had in common with many of the Old West gunfighters is he was one of these guys who became so good at his profession with the gun that he straddled the law sort of on the nefarious side, but also on the good side. So we'll talk about that later, but many of the Old West gunfighters became so good at gunfire and handling guns that they were often hired by the city authorities to run the rest of the bad guys out of town because they were capable of it. They had the experience, the ability, and so forth. So, who was Ben Thompson? Well, that Masterson, who was with him during what's called the Battle of the Royal Gorge, which was when the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad got into a controversy and a fight with the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe railroads to who was going to have the rights to build the railroad through the Royal Gorge. And both sides hired known gunfighters to come and defend their rights and try to gain the right of way and so forth. So Ben Thompson was one of these men who were hired to strong arm, if you will, the interest of the, I think he was on the Denver Rio Grande side, if I remember correctly. And Bat Masterson was also there. I forgot which side he was on, but the point is Bat Masterson later described Ben Thompson as the deadliest gunfighter in the Old West. And in the newspaper interview, they asked Bat Masterson, who himself was a very accomplished, famous person in the West and certainly a good judge of character, why was Ben Thompson so deadly and feared and so forth. And he said, not only accuracy in a gunfight, but that's more important than speed, but the most important quality of a gunfighter is a coolness under fire, that they never got rattled. They could handle a tense, deadly situation without getting exasperated or perturbed or anything. And Ben Thompson was certainly that, as we'll see in a minute when we go through his life history. But the main thing about Ben Thompson is he was just cool under fire, and he proved it numerous times. He basically, after his childhood, became a gambler, and that was sort of his favorite pastime, or even profession, if you will. But early on, let's talk about how he grew up and what caused him to be this way. As we said, his parents lived in Austin, Texas, and he started out as kind of a wild boy, like much of the Old West gunfighters. He was kind of a juvenile delinquent, basically, in our terms, modern language. He got in trouble with the law constantly when he was an adolescent, and in numerous accounts talk about him firing on some of his friends. One story was that he got mad at one of his friends, and they agreed to face off with shotguns at 40 yards apart and shoot at each other. And Ben was slightly wounded, but the other boy suffered much more dangerous wounds. So that's the kind of background that Ben grew up with. Well, in 1861, during the outbreak of the Civil War, he joined the Confederacy, and he was a member of Rip Ford's regiment down on the border, especially in Laredo, Texas, and he soon got into a fracas with soldiers. He was always gambling and so forth. Let's see, 42, by that time he was, 20 years old, basically. And so here he is, a young soldier on the border, fighting, and so they put him in jail, and the story has him bribing his guards and jumping across the border to Mexico, and he soon began to ally himself with the forces of Maximilian, Emperor Maximilian, who was then the Emperor of Mexico. You all know that story. Well, he fought supposedly with Maximilian forces until Maximilian and the Loyalists lost, and Maximilian was executed in 1862. So he sometimes, and especially during this episode at the border, was accompanied by his notorious brother, who was Billy Thompson. They called him Texas Billy, and he was just kind of a ne'er-do-well. He wasn't as deadly and professional as Ben was, but Billy was there with him, and as we'll see later, Billy becomes kind of an important partner of Ben in some of these gunfights and so forth. They got into crime, and stuff like that. And about that time, during 1870, Texas was under what's called Reconstruction, which was a Republican-installed state officers that enforced the law on the old Confederates. And of course, that didn't go too well, but oftentimes Ben and Billy found themselves fighting with the Reconstruction government. The next thing significantly that he did was he formed a partnership with a well-known Austin saloon keeper named Phil Coe. And Phil Coe wanted to operate and open a saloon in Abilene, Kansas. So Ben Thompson went up to Abilene, Kansas with Phil Coe and opened the Bull's Head Saloon. And the stories and newspaper accounts have it this way, that they had this real gaudy painted sign of the bull showing objectionable parts of the bull's anatomy, And City Marshal Wild Bill Hickok objected to this, and he told them, hey, take that down, I want that up there. And they refused, and so that set the stage for Ben Thompson to have a kind of a feud going, and Phil Coe more so with Wild Bill Hickok. Well, within a year later, they get into a gunfight, and Wild Bill kills Phil Coe right there on the city square. I won't go into details, it's all in the history book. But at that point, Ben Thompson, rather than fight it out and try to continue, he just left Kansas and came back to Austin. In 1873, however, a very significant thing happened. His brother, during that episode in Abilene, one night was armed with a shotgun, and Ben and Billy went out on the square, and all of a sudden Billy was drunk. He turns around and fired his shotgun and killed Sheriff Chauncey Whitney. And Ben said, my God, Billy, you've killed our best friend. So that was a bad event. One poignant note on that is that as Sheriff Whitney lay dying, he said an amazing thing. He said, oh, it wasn't his fault, I forgive him. So he actually forgave Billy Thompson for killing him accidentally. But that was a bad incident in their lives. I've got a few notes here based on Bill O'Neill's good book, Encyclopedia of Gunfighters. I recommend that because it's a nice synopsis of the major events in gunfighters' lives. So some of these dates and facts that I'm telling you today are based on Bill O'Neill's book. Well, in 1876, Ben was back in Austin, and he was becoming a feared gunfighter with a big reputation, and consequently a lot of his, quote, friends would use his name to scare off some of their enemies. And a case in point was with Captain L.E. Edwards, who was, by one newspaper account, a shyster lawyer in Austin. He has a kind of a fascinating background too, but I discovered this man just a couple of years ago when I bought this rifle here. Actually, it's a carbine, which was presented to Ben Thompson by Captain Edwards. And you see the inlaid silver star right here, which is verified in the Winchester records, which is very important. And the presentation reads like this. It's that silver Texas star with TEXAS around the points. It says, Captain L.E. Edwards to Ben Thompson, Austin City, February the 4th, 1876. This gun was unknown until just a few years ago. And it has a fascinating history. It's got special features. Obviously, it's all engraved and fancy and so forth. The important thing is it's verified in the Winchester records. So Edwards, as it turns out, had used Ben Thompson's name to defend himself in a Texas cattlemen's convention. And when they threw Edwards out of the cattlemen's convention, he went down the street to his friend Ben Thompson and said, hey Ben, here's what they did to me, like whining little boy type thing. So Ben, the story goes, straps on his 6-shooter and walks down the street in Austin. and breaks up the cattlemen's convention and says, "Where's that SOB that don't like Captain Edwards?" Well, Shanghai Pierce, who was a famous Texas cattleman, was one of the first guys. He jumped up on the table and pandemonium broke out. And I think it was Shanghai Pierce jumped out the window, and needless to say, they all just vacated with notorious Ben Thompson, the gunfighter, there to defend this guy Edwards. So in appreciation for that defense, Captain Edwards presented this gun to Ben Thompson. So Ben was always sort of straddling the law, remember, sometimes on one side, sometimes on the other, but gaining a formidable reputation by that time. And also in 1876, he got into a feud with a local saloon owner named Mark Wilson. And Mark Wilson was a pretty well-known guy in Austin, but he and Ben got sideways, and he ended up killing Mark Wilson. So that further enhanced his reputation, and people really began to fear him because, again, he was just so cool and deadly under fire. I mean, people would shoot at him and he wouldn't even move until they got through, and then he'd just pull out a gun, such as this one that we're going to show you next, which, according to one account, is very similar to the gun that he used later in life when he came to San Antonio in 1884, the last year of his life. But this gun is factory engraved, Colt 6-shooter, peacemakers, so-called, but it's a very fancy model with the ivory grips and factory engraved and so forth. But I wanted you to see this gun because this supposedly, although Ben Thompson's gun has never, well, with one exception, been found. Collectors have been looking for Ben Thompson's gun for a long time, but they've never really found an undisputed Ben Thompson gun. So he used one like that. By 1880, actually in 1879, he ran for city marshal of Austin, but he was defeated. Well, he tried again in 1881 and he won. So he became the city marshal of Austin. And I have a picture here showing him with the city council of Austin. You can see Ben right there in the middle with his little cap on and his gold badge, and his gold Austin City Marshal badge and the cap are known in the hands of another collector here in Texas, but that's the way he looked in 1876. This actually is another picture of him, a very rare photo, which turned out to be his funerary photo that was placed. This actual photo was placed on his casket when he was killed, but we'll get to that later. It just shows another picture of him as city marshal of Austin. I've been interested in Ben Thompson and Kingfisher and the Vaudeville Saloon for many years, so I have collected this stuff for the last 30 or 40 years. So about this time, Ben Thompson got $5,000 supposedly from the Royal Gorge War, and with that he came back to Austin and he went into partnership with a guy named Neff was one of them, and he opened his own saloon, which he always wanted, called the Iron Front Saloon. And it was on 6th Street, right just about 5 blocks down from the Capitol. And he had quite a reputation for running the Iron Front Saloon. These are actual tokens from the Iron Front Saloon in Austin, which became a gambling den and so forth, and there are a lot of stories there which I won't go into. But here's another rare artifact. This was a lemon strainer marked Iron Front that was used during his sojourn as a saloon keeper in Austin at the Iron Front. The Iron Front didn't last very long, so the pictures of the Iron Front are kind of rare. There are only one or two. But by 1880, he had gotten to a feud with Jack Harris in San Antonio because Ben loved San Antonio. And he would go to San Antonio to gamble out of town, and he would usually stay at the Menger Hotel. We have his original signatures several times where he checked into the Menger Hotel. And he got into this feud with Jack Harris, who is this fella right here, who was one of the best known personalities in San Antonio. He was a leader of the Democratic Party. He was the first guy to get electric lights in his establishment in San Antonio, which was about 1880. And he's a fascinating guy in his own right. Jack Harris was born in Connecticut. He was supposedly red-haired, freckle-faced, but he has a very interesting history. He was actually part of the filibustering expedition to Nicaragua with William Walker, and that's a whole fascinating story in itself. But here is Jack Harris, one of the very rare photos out of the McCubbin collection, which shows Jack Harris as a frontiersman scout while he was with William Walker down in Nicaragua. Well, here is Ben Thompson, one of the original cabinet cards, also from the McCubbin collection, but that is what he looked like. He wasn't very tall. He was only about 5'6", I think, or 5'8", kind of heavy set, but deadly and deadly guy. Here's another picture of him about that time. And I think I showed this later picture of Jack Harris. So, in 1882, as a matter of fact, on July the 11th, 1882, Ben came to San Antonio, checked into the Menger Hotel, and went down to the Vaudeville Saloon, which at that time was the #1 hot spot in San Antonio. I mean, that's where everybody who was anybody went. And he was determined to have it out with Jack Harris. Well, it was a fascinating story what happened. He gets in this feud and he goes in one door, meanwhile Jack Harris, and then he has a drink and leaves, and then Jack Harris comes in the back door with a shotgun and stands behind these wooden blinds in the light inside the saloon. And Ben Thompson, somebody said, hey, Jack Harris is in there with a gun. And so Ben steps out on the curb in the street, 20 yards, 30 yards from inside the saloon. Now, this was about at 10 o'clock at night, visualized. So here you have Ben Thompson out there in the dark, and he hollered to the saloon, hey, Jack, what are you going to do with that gun? And Jack said, I'm ready for you. I'm going to kill you, as so be, if you come in here again, because he didn't want Ben to even come into his establishment. Well, Ben just jerked out his 6-shooter here, which is probably one that looked just like this, and fired twice through the blinds. And in a miraculous stroke of Thompson luck, the first bullet ricocheted off a wall and hit Jack Harris right here in the heart. And we have a diagram of that, and not only a diagram, but it is the actual court drawing showing the bullet hitting Jack Harris. So they gathered Jack Harris up. He was bleeding profusely. They took him to his house 2 blocks away, and he bled out and died. So after that, a former friend, actually, of Ben Thompson, a guy named Billy Sims, who is this guy, and another man named Joe Foster took over the management of the vaudeville, and they started running the vaudeville theater, it's sometimes called. They had dancing acts, and we'll show you a broadside of what was going on there. And Billy Sims and Joe Foster told, or sent word to Ben Thompson, you are not welcome here at the vaudeville anymore. Don't ever come here again. Well, you know how that sets with bad guys. Bad guys go where they're not supposed to go. That's what makes them bad guys. Ben, after he killed Jack Harris, he resigned as city marshal of Austin, and his life kind of started on a downward spiral. He started gambling more, he was drunk more, excessive drinking, the records say. His debts began to mount up. He had legal problems. I have a copy of his will, and you can see from his will, suits were brought against him, and he's not a particularly wonderful guy by that time. He's developing a lot of enemies and so forth. And so now we get what I call the final chapter of Ben's life. And a while ago when I mentioned one of the things that makes Ben Thompson interesting is the circumstances around his death. Most American gunfighters, we know pretty much how they were killed or died, whatever, but Ben Thompson is one of the few, along with Johnny Ringo, the demise of which is still under scrutiny and not understood very well. In Thompson's case, it's still a mystery. And the Wild West History Association in 2023 is having our annual convention in San Antonio in the Mayor Hotel, the same hotel where Ben Thompson stayed, and his name is recorded in the registries. So we are going to present various papers on the vaudeville saloon, Ben Thompson, King Fisher, who was also killed the same night, and various other things, not to leave out the San Antonio City Marshal at the time, who was a guy named Phil Chardin. And we'll show you a portrait of Phil Chardin, who is a very interesting guy himself. There were no photos known of Phil Chardin until recently. And the portrait of Phil Chardin that we're going to show you in this video was rescued from a leaky closet in a Masonic lodge. And I found that because I read his wife's will, and she had as one of her conditions in her will that she was leaving, I think $5,000 it was, which was a lot of money in 1903 when he died, to have a portrait done of her husband, who was instrumental in establishing the Alamo Masonic Lodge deal. So after I saw that, I began to try to find the portrait, and eventually we found it and rescued it and preserved it. So you'll see a picture of that. Ben's downward spiral kind of came to a head in March of 1884 when his good friend King Fisher, who was a deputy sheriff in Uvalde County, came to Austin for a sheriff's convention. And while he was there, he went over to see his friend Ben Thompson, and they got to drinking and carousing like men like that usually do. And Ben happened to mention to his friend Kingfisher that he wanted to see a play which he understood was being shown in San Antonio, and Kingfisher said, well, I'm going to ride the train back through San Antonio anyway this evening, so you want to go with me? And so Ben Thompson said yes. So they found themselves on the train headed toward San Antonio, along with Marshal, U.S. Deputy Marshal Hal Gosling, who was a well-known guy too, and he, according to some accounts, telegraphed or somehow got the message ahead to the vaudeville saloon that, quote, Ben Thompson is coming to town with hell in his neck. So he kind of alerted the staff, who you'll remember was Billy Sims and Joe Foster at this time, that Ben Thompson was on his way, probably. They didn't know for sure he was going to come to the vaudeville because you'll remember that they had forbid him to come there before. Well, on the evening of March 11th, 1884, things came to a head, and Kingfisher and Ben Thompson were by this time totally plastered drunk. They go to Turner's Opera House to see the play. I think the play was called East Lynne, and the actress's name, I can't remember her name at the moment, but Ben was kind of infatuated with her. And they saw the play. They get drunker and drunker. They're still drinking. Billy, Texas Billy, his brother, was there. And so what do bad guys do, right? They do the only thing that they're forbidden to do. Newspaper says that they caught a hack, which is a two-seat buggy, over to the vaudeville theater. And just before they left, Billy Thompson supposedly gave his gun, that's described just like this gun, to Ben to protect himself while he goes over to the place where he was unwelcome. So they arrived, and it's a long story, fascinating, but I won't go into all the details. They enter, it was a two-story affair. By golly, we have a picture of it here. Great. Now, this is what it looked like. This is the vaudeville theater, the hottest spot in town. This is where everybody who's anybody went. It was at the northwest corner of Soledad at Commerce Street. And that site where that saloon was experienced so many killings that the name of that corner was called Fatal Corner because so many murders and gunfights and so on happened there. So the story goes that they go into the bottom floor of the vaudeville, and Billy Sims and Joe, well, actually it was just Billy Sims. Joe Foster was upstairs, and Billy Sims was trying to be cool and welcomed them to the place, and he was nervous, and of course everybody's nervous, and so he took them upstairs to where they could look down on the stage where girls are dancing and so where the acts are being performed. They had everything. We'll show you a play, Bill. Magic acts, comedy, comedians, Eddie Foy, people like that, singers, so forth. So visualize the two baddest men in Texas at the time, Kingfisher and Ben Thompson, are sitting up there. The floor plan actually was very much like the Birdcage Theater in Tombstone. So they're up there with these booths around the sides and curtains where you could draw them for privacy, and the girls, of course, are around. And so they're up there watching what's going on downstairs. And so Billy Sims nervously they asked for a drink, and then that's while they asked for cigars, and he's kind of nervously wanting to get them out of there before something bad happens. So he finally got them up, and Kingfisher was ahead of Ben Thompson, I think is the way it goes, and they start downstairs. Well, just as they reach a staircase, Ben Thompson looks over there and he sees Joe Foster. Well, Joe Foster was the one that he really held accountable for what he thought he got cheated the year before, and he accused Joe Foster of running a house of ill repute and just living off the income of the girls. So he confronts Joe Foster and he says, "Isn't that Joe Foster over there, Billy?" And Billy says, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, I want to go shake his hand." So he goes over there to Joe Foster, extends his hand, and Foster said, "Ben, you know I can't shake hands with you. You killed Jack Harris." Oh, hell, that was the worst thing that was possible to bring that up against that previous killing. So when he said that, by some accounts, Ben drew his pistol. One account says he stuck it in his mouth. I don't know. Some people say he just slapped his face with it, whatever, and pulled the trigger. Well, it misfired. So they're all scrambling around. By this time, Kingfisher jumps on the pile, tries to separate him. House security officer Jacobo Coy grabs Ben's pistol by the cylinder, and if you'll notice when you cock this pistol, if you stick your finger right there in between the hammer and the frame, when you pull the trigger, it won't go off. See how that caught my finger? Well, that's evidently what happened to Ben, and Jacobo Coy kept him from firing like this, which would have been the normal situation. Well, miraculously, it didn't go off the first time, because when they checked his gun later, it only had one spent round and the rest of the rounds were still live in the gun. So they all fall to the floor, and some of them are hit, and the newspaper describes it's just a bloody gore of everything. They're all wrestling around Jacobo Coy, Foster, Sims, Fisher, Thompson. And about that time, according to many accounts, gunfire erupts from, the inquest said, above and behind them. Well, the only thing above and behind them was a curtain drawn, kind of a closet situation, so we'll get to that later. During gunfire, Ben Thompson was hit 9 times and Kingfisher was hit 13 times. And there were only supposed to be, 9 and 13, that's what, 22? Yeah, 22 shots. Well, there were only supposed to be 3 revolvers in the room. In fact, Phil Chardin, the city marshal, challenged him and said, "You're not supposed to have guns in there." Well, they said, it's okay because they're both officers of the law. So they let Kingfisher take his gun in there, and Ben had one too, which was not the norm, because by that time San Antonio already had an ordinance where you're not supposed to have firearms. Well, they got out of that, and that's what caused this. Both guys are dead. Jacobo Coy is hit once, minor wound, but Joe Foster got hit in the leg and it severed his femoral artery, and he was just gushing blood. And the newspaper accounts say that when they tried to help him downstairs, that they were just slipping into blood and gore. It was bad, evidently. They took him exactly to the same house where Jack Harris had died 20 months before that in 1882. And the doctors tried to stop the bleeding. They said, "We're going to have to amputate your leg." And he finally gave in to that, but he died anyway. So the question, of course, is who killed Ben Thompson and Kingfisher? This is the only time that I know of, and I've made a study of this for the past 30, 40 years. This is the only time that I could think of where 2 of the most famous Old West gunfighters were killed simultaneously in one place without exactly knowing how. Well, the they held the inquest next day, and the jury concluded, by the way, I actually have the original court testimony here. You can see it says, this is actually when Jack Harris was killed. Inquisition from the view of the dead body of Jack Harris, July 1882. And there's one just like this when Thompson and Fisher were killed. But in this report, the jury concluded that Ben Thompson and King Fisher died from gunshot wounds fired by pistols in the hands of Billy Sims and Joe Foster and House Policeman Jacobo Coy, who some say never fired a shot. Matter of fact, King Fisher's pistol was still in the holster. He never even got it out of the holster before he was hit so many times. And Ben, as I explained earlier, only had one shot fired from his gun. Well, 22 shots minimum is more than the 18 that are held by 3 6-shooters. You get it? 3 of them are 6, 18, but there were 22 shots in the bodies. So we know that somebody else, unverified, was shooting in that room. And it's been a mystery ever since then. We really don't know who it was, perhaps fired from the curtains. Several accounts say with Winchester rifles, but that's really a myth because they just found Winchester shells, which were also fired in Colt's pistol. In fact, Charles Hummel, who was the leading gun dealer in San Antonio at the time, testified that Ben Thompson bought 5 cartridges. They were Winchester shells, which means that they were made by Winchester, not that they were fired necessarily from a Winchester gun. And he said there is also a pistol which uses that shell. It is a Colt's, and that was recorded in the court testimony when Ben killed Jack Harris. Well, there was an inquest on Ben Thompson's body. There were powder burns on his face and a lot of other details which Dr. Bailey and I intend to expose at the upcoming Wild West History Association meeting in San Antonio in July of 2023. And the fascinating thing is there has never been a real modern type forensic investigation of the trajectories of the bullets and how many bullets were fired and all that kind of stuff. We don't have a nice diagram like we are going to show you on the Jack Harris killing. But nevertheless, this is the sort of thing that we do in the Wild West History Association. In this case, we're reenacting the gunfight and trying to figure out who killed notorious gunfighter Ben Thompson. So that's just one of the things we do, and you should come to the convention and join the Wild West History Association. So thank you very much. We hope you enjoyed this video, and happy trails. We'll see you down the road.
I got one question, maybe 2 to ask you. That was wonderful. If any of our viewers wanted to go visit the grave of Harris, where is he buried? I know that Ben Thompson is buried in Oakwood Cemetery in Austin.
That's right.
Because I've been there and I've got an exact location if anybody wants to go visit it. And where's Harris buried?
I'm glad you brought that up. Harris is buried right down Commerce Street in San Antonio, Masonic Cemetery number 1. I know where that is. And it's in 1982, there was an organization formed in San Antonio called Friends of Jack Harris, and they restored the tombstone, put a big historic sign up there and everything. And guess who's buried right behind him? Joe Foster And just a few plots away is City Marshal Phil Hardin, whose grave we restored Wild West History Association last year. But all of those men, actors in this drama, are buried right there. Oh, and I forgot to mention a real interesting thing. Remember when I told you that right after Thompson killed Harris, see, Jack Harris couldn't see Thompson out there in the dark, but Thompson could see him. He was inside of the light. Well, after the killing, the accounts say that he strode down the street and checked into the Menger Hotel. Instead of the Marshal Hardin didn't arrest him, and the San Antonio Sheriff Tom McCall, whose badge I have, didn't even arrest him. They said, okay, it's all right, you stay at the hotel, we'll pick you up tomorrow. Can you imagine that today? But all those characters are buried right there.
That's great. Now now tell me one thing. Wasn't Harris and Thompson in the same cavalry unit during the war between the states?
Yes.
Texas, is it the 2nd?
I'm rusty on that. I've heard 2nd Texas Cavalry, but it was Rip Ford's regiment that Thompson was in,
okay.
So I suspect that's probably the same regiment. I have it somewhere, but I can't remember.
Now, Rip Ford is buried in the same cemetery, one of the old San Antonio cemeteries. Now, all these cemeteries are they're less than a mile from the Menger, so if you come to the Menger, you've got to go to these cemeteries. You won't believe all the famous people that are buried in these cemeteries. We can give you locations on all of them.
Yes, exactly. Lee Hall, Texas Ranger,
Yeah.
Rip Ford,
O.C. Hanks,
O.C. Hanks, George Baylor, Texas Ranger Captain.
Alamo Defenders,
Samuel Maverick, from whom the word Maverick came from, just lots
Samuel
of famous
Walker,
people.
where the Walker coat came from.
Yes, Ad Gillespie, who was Walker's buddy.
It just goes on and on and on. Well, thank you so much for being here with us.
Well,
thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm glad to share my collection with you. That's why we do this. Adios.